Hey there, it's Art Stewart from Strategic Impact Partners, and this is What Matters Most on YouTube and LinkedIn. And our guest today is Alexander McCobin, who is the recent departing Chief Executive Officer of Conscious Capitalism. Alexander, welcome.
Art, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
You know, a lot of people have heard of the conscious capitalism movement. It's been around for a while. I know that you've been neck deep in its evolution for a number of years. Why don't we start with the basics? How did you first get involved with the movement that then became an organization?
So, I got involved when the book Conscious Capitalism was first published back in 2013. At the time, I was actually a philosophy graduate student specializing in business ethics and writing a dissertation on the concept of the moral responsibility of business being based on its purpose. So, when I read Conscious Capitalism, it was so aligned with my research. I wanted to go to the first conference they were organizing to help with my dissertation.
Mhm.
But I was actually so inspired by the business leaders that I met there, like John Mackey from Whole Foods, Kip Tyndall from the Container Store, and so many others who were taking these ideas and turning them into reality and changing people's lives, that I was inspired and didn't finish the PhD in philosophy at Georgetown, a mutual alma mater of ours, and instead went back to an organization I had started years before as an undergrad and built that up on conscious capitalist principles until the organization Conscious Capitalism was reaching an inflection point and wanted to grow beyond being just a small club for the founders to a larger movement. And that was the one thing that could have taken me away from what I was doing before, because we need conscious capitalism in this world more than ever before. And over the last 6 years, it's been incredible to see the world really come to realize that in so many ways, where we've shifted from persuading people to these principles, like the organization was doing 6 years ago when I started, to really helping them understand how to implement them, educating business leaders on what to do, which is where it is today.
Well, that's an interesting point to follow up on. When you mention when you first got involved, and folks like John Mackey and his company Whole Foods, which was very much a hands-on leadership success story that he had with that company. In what ways were folks like John Mackey? I mean, I think of Howard Schultz from Starbucks, another very values focused CEO. In what ways in those early days were these companies sort of living out these principles in their everyday operations that sort of gave fuel to the conceptualization that was represented in the book?
So that's a great question, because it's important to remember that the philosophy of conscious capitalism wasn't developed in a vacuum. It was developed by business leaders who were trying to articulate the principles they were running their businesses on for decades beforehand in order to establish a common vernacular and way of thinking about business that other business leaders and other people in society could understand business through. So when you look at the four tenets of conscious capitalism, and even just the basic premise that capitalism is fundamentally a human endeavor, people working to help other people out, that sprang up from what businesses were already doing at the time. Not all of them, obviously, because there was a desire to get more businesses to embrace these principles, but enough out there that they were able to start an organization and lay the foundations for a larger movement of leaders who agreed with those principles.
Well, you know, let's keep on those examples of Whole Foods and Starbucks because they are two experiences that most Americans and even visitors abroad want to experience when they come here because of the nature of those businesses, a major grocery chain and a major coffee chain. It was something about the customer experience very early on for both of those companies that I think, at least from my own intimate experience as a shopper, felt it was well informed personnel. It was values oriented sourcing of products from supply partners. It was the kind of experience when you walked into the retail premises was clearly distinctive than most other retail experiences you would have. So again, tell me what you think were some of those early characteristics that were being lived out in the customer experience that were part of what became the definition of conscious capitalism. And you point out this in your tenets of the concept, this sense of consciousness, conscious culture, conscious leadership. Talk a little bit about that.
So you're hitting on what I think many customers understood intuitively for a long time before the terms conscious leadership or conscious culture were even out there in the world. Because when you walk into a conscious capitalism storefront that's serving customers, you often feel how authentic their values are. It's not just
Right.
written up on the walls. It's something that you really do feel from the energy from the employees who are embodying that culture, that you're able to read about from the lessons from leaders in those companies, and that you see in the decisions for what they sell, how they do it, and how they treat customers. But I would even take it a step further. What we all have experienced as customers at these stores goes beyond that to other stakeholders in these companies having similar experiences as well, but in a different way. Vendors wanting to work with these companies not only because they may get better prices, but because they have better relationships with these kinds of
Yeah.
companies. Investors knowing that they're going to get a better return on their investment from these companies while they're living out these values. And communities wanting these kinds of businesses oftentimes because it elevates them and they're actively involved in supporting them. So it really also gets to that tenet of stakeholder orientation that is so critical to a conscious approach to business.
Well, you just mentioned some broader contexts besides the customer experience, right? Which is very intimate in the at the retail level in the actual premises visit for a customer. But when you talk about investor relations and you talk about supply chain and supplier relations, then you're getting into the real holistic context of conscious capitalism. And I think one of the things that is so relevant to the movement today as we look at this fuller arc of what we call corporate integrity practice and the new ESG is this idea of new mechanisms that are really required now to reduce risk as a business, right? Because you've got issues of perpetual volatility. You have a growing number of external factors, phenomena, happenings that leaders of companies no longer have any direct control over. The only thing they can control is how they choose to respond to what they can't control. So, talk a little bit, if you would, about the risk management advantages when you embrace this kind of business model concept.
So the great thing about taking a conscious approach, and especially this stakeholder orientation, is that you're looking to minimize risks that you're taking by understanding the interconnection of the interests of everyone that a business touches. And instead of making trade offs between them, thinking that the only way to help the customer out is to take something from suppliers, or the only way to give a better return to shareholders is to lower the benefits for employees, finding the ways that you're able to actually fulfill the interests of everyone at the same time, which minimizes the challenges to those decisions, that minimizes the likelihood people will be upset and you'll lose one of those stakeholder groups, or even have unintended consequences that you didn't calculate because you pushed too hard on one group over another. So it really is about finding ways to minimize that risk.
Well, all of this too correlates to parallel movements that have all been a part of this long evolution of corporate integrity practice. It used to be called CSR or corporate responsibility. Our team here at Strategic Impact Partners has recoined it corporate integrity because the notion of that really addresses the heart of the challenge, the opportunity, and the necessity for evolutionary transformation, if you will. How do you think the shared value movement has played into your work with conscious capitalism? I mean, Michael Porter and Mark Kramer out at Harvard came up with a very interesting concept called shared value, came out of a book, came out of a series of books, came out of a lot of scholarly work and development with NGOs and marginalized communities and economies around the world. Where do you all fit in, the conscious capitalism movement with shared value and with some of the other correlating companion components of you, if you will, to this larger current corporate integrity context we find ourselves in?
So I love that you're talking about other organizations and other terminology with this because there are a lot of different names for very similar efforts out there.
Well,
You all
and people get really confused, right? It's like, well, who's stands for what and who's serving what or who's trying to do what, right?
That's absolutely right. And while what I say about these different organizations and efforts is that there's typically about 70 or 80% that they have in common with each other. Whether you say it's about corporate integrity or business as a force for good or something like that, there is this common sense of direction that they're all heading in. But there are 20 to 30% areas of difference between them, either in terms of what they think that really means as to the changes they're trying to affect in business or the strategy to get there. And it is important for people to take a look at the different organizations and evaluate their ultimate end goal and their strategy for getting there to decide which ones they want to be a part of. And that's actually healthy in successful movements because there is no silver bullet to this. And you're not going to get everyone to agree on 100% of the issues. It's worthwhile to recognize it's valuable for there to be groups like Conscious Capitalism that's really focused on helping individual leaders understand how to lead by values and infuse businesses with purpose and this different perspective of how to operate versus, say, a B Corp certification model out there. And it's important for there to be groups like Conscious Capitalism that really are taking a pro-capitalist perspective with this when others may be more critical of it from the outset. And that leads to better debates and a healthier movement overall.
Well, and I think too, if you're trying to create a synergistic ecosystem, if you will, where, as you say, there is at least 70% common worldview, common pursuit of a higher purpose in all of these different groups, better to find ways to maintain and grow a synergistic ecosystem. So in doing that, you've got to allow different pockets and perspectives, as you say, with conscious capitalism, focusing particularly on the leadership component of these organizations and shared value, looking at global sort of NGO kinds of work and marginalized communities and how to create interdependencies in economies. Um, let's talk a little bit about is it the four tenets of conscious capitalism? I don't want us to not touch a little bit, if you could, on those four tenets.
So we've already touched on three of them. That includes having conscious cultures where people can be their authentic selves and are actually better for having worked at the company than they were before. Conscious leadership, where the people in charge embody the values of the company and go beyond just analytic and emotional intelligence to systemic and spiritual intelligence to represent what the company stands for. And stakeholder orientation, which is about moving out of a win-lose mindset that you're only able to help one stakeholder group, say shareholders, by taking from others like customers or the employees, and instead get to a win-win-win mindset where everyone can do better off because they're all interrelated. The last tenet that we haven't really touched on yet is higher purpose, which is actually the first tenet of conscious capitalism, articulating that business is not just about making money or making a profit. In fact, while that's important, it's only a means to serve the higher purpose for which every business ought to exist. They ought to articulate what their purpose is and why they're making a profit to better the world in some way. And when a business is run on those four tenets, it's well positioned to elevate humanity through its work and to be an even more successful business because this is what leads to long-term success.
We were talking earlier in preparation that we both have been observing an uptick in sort of the opposition forces, particularly around the global ESG movement, because its maturity is escalating. particularly in the public markets context, with pending actions and some really groundbreaking change of behavior on the part of the Security and Exchange Commission, among many other government forces. And of course, stock markets around the world, some of that coming from some good examples that have already been set by some of the EU companies and countries rather, and other pockets of more advanced understanding of the value of these practices. And of course, so much of it being driven now by the climate crisis. Uh, you know, what's all the fuss about that we're getting this kind of opposition? I mean, there was a Wall Street Journal piece that came out a few weeks ago, taking the typical opposition argument, between that it's a progressive or a conservative or a left versus right point of view about capitalism, and even kind of trying to make another case in defense of shareholder capitalism, when we really started to move steadily into an economic model of stakeholder capitalism, and I would argue multi-stakeholder capitalism 20 years ago, really, if you look back at it. First of all, how would you define stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism?
Well, I think the difference between the two really is whether the purpose of business is to serve shareholders as the singular stakeholder group that matters, and other stakeholder groups are means to serving them, or if a business is about serving all stakeholders and finding the interconnection between them. But that's the way I would approach it. I think part of the reason we're seeing pushback on the shift to stakeholder capitalism right now is because it means different things to different groups. And so they're not always talking about the same thing. To paint with a broad brush, I think there are two factions in this debate right now. There is the top down approach to stakeholder capitalism that wants to prescribe for companies which stakeholders matter and what way they do, how companies are supposed to serve them, and really tell them what to do, which is typically regulated and imposed from the outside. And then there's the bottom up approach, where businesses are identifying who their stakeholders are themselves, that matter the most, figuring out their interests, and will innovate and come up with different ways to serve all of their stakeholders in order to address the same needs and have the same values of protecting the environment, sustainability, helping everyone out. But those are two very different approaches, and we're seeing a big debate between which one of those is the right approach to stakeholder capitalism, with some people criticizing one side or the other, but painting the broad brush of applying it to all of stakeholder capitalism.
Well, as always happens in free markets, the market will determine what's going to work. And clearly, the market is showing that multi-stakeholder capitalism is the paradigm going forward, because it is a globalized world out there now, like it or not. Alexander, it's been great talking with you. This is very important stuff. We'd love to have you back in a future episode and talk more about all of these concepts to do with how we can move forward, whether you're operating in the public market or the private market context. It doesn't matter. It's now about economics based on purpose and values and integrity. So Alexander McCobin, from the Conscious Capitalism movement. Thanks for being with us. Art Stewart, we'll see you next time right here on What Matters Most on YouTube and LinkedIn.